Hi, everyone. My name is Melinda Jackson. I'm one of Professor Yip's graduate students this semester, and I'll be giving the lecture on language brokering this week. If any of you are 1.5 or second generation immigrants, you might find this topic really interesting. So now let's find out exactly what language brokering is. Language brokering refers to the various activities that mediate and negotiate interactions between monolingual speakers or between minority language speakers and mainstream majority language speaking society. We're mainly focused on child language brokering. So, why do parents need their children to become language brokers? It's because their parents don't speak the language as first generation immigrants, and their command of English is usually not very good. Some of them don't know the language at all, so as soon as their child starts to speak English, the child will take on the responsibility of becoming a language broker in the family. We'll discuss the drawbacks as well as the positive benefits of a child becoming a language broker. Here are some of the situations that require language brokering. For example, being at the doctor's office, on the phone, at the parent's workplace, filling out immigration paperwork, filling out job applications, translating notes from school, being the interpreter at parent-teacher conferences, translating at the bank, and maybe even talking to law enforcement officers. Obviously, this isn't easy, and some children start doing this at 5 years old, which can be very, very stressful for the child. Before we discuss the negatives, let's talk about the positives. So, what are the benefits of language brokering? To start with, children usually get higher reading scores if they do a lot of language brokering at home. Some of them also perform better academically. Because language brokers often translate documents that require a high level of understanding, such as notes and letters from school, bank or credit card statements, job applications, government and insurance forms, they develop a more sophisticated vocabulary that could help them build their lexicons. Some will have better cognitive abilities because being a language broker entails involvements in more complex situations than a child would normally encounter, for instance, in legal or medical situations. And child language brokers may develop higher problem solving skills and better decision making strategies. Some have increased self esteem and a sense of self efficacy, which makes sense because as a child, you take pride in being able to do adult tasks and being able to help your parents. They're enabled with a greater perspective taking and they show more empathy. This is probably due to the fact that they're doing adult tasks and they're seeing the world from a different perspective than most children. Some have greater respect for their parents when they're language brokering because they learn things that normal kids don't know about their parents. They may realize that their parents sacrificed a lot to come to this country. There's also the benefit of parent-child bonding and the strengthening of mutual ties. The language brokering activity allows a child to better understand their parents. It also provides parents and their children more opportunities to communicate with each other and more opportunities to practice their mother tongue. And this is really very important because second generation immigrants, or even 1.5, gradually start to use English, the dominant language, more, which means they lose opportunities to use the mother tongue. So being a language broker gives them a lot of opportunities to use and to practice their mother tongue. The children will also become more mature and maybe not ask their parents to buy them things because they know how much money is in their bank accounts. So they don't ask for things that other children have. This could also be seen as negative, depending on how you look at it. But this is very much related to the point that children may have more empathy and they may look at things from different perspectives if they're language brokers. Children may also develop better relationships with their teachers because they often serve as interpreters, and this helps build trust between the teacher and the child. Now let's discuss the drawbacks. First, there's the stress and burden of having to be a language broker. Can you imagine what it would be like having to talk to law enforcement or filling out immigration forms at the age of 7 or 8? My friend's daughter, who's now 13, serves as the language broker for her mom. And I know she used to feel a lot of stress when she was younger and had to translate for her mom at the bank. The stress was because there's certain terminology used in banks and other agencies that 7-year-olds simply don't know. Language brokering can also cause some depressive symptoms in some children as well as lower self-efficacy among college students. There can also be a lower perceived maternal support and low regard for mothers. These are also listed as positive, so there's some contradictions here, which has something to do with the lived experiences of the brokers, but we'll get back to that later. Another drawback is that sometimes parents resent their own position of being helpless, and they feel embarrassed because a child knows so much about things they'd prefer that they didn't know, but they still have to rely on the child language broker. Sometimes the parent will treat the child harshly and criticize them more than the other siblings, simply because they know what they know. Teachers often express concern about how often some kids are asked to leave school to help the family. They're asked to leave school in case of emergencies or will need to come in late or leave early to serve as a language broker for appointments. Language brokering also challenges the traditional structure of generational boundaries, families, and relationships. This is because children are now doing adult tasks, and in the traditional family structure, adults do all of these tasks, and the children are just expected to do well in school, do their homework, and maybe some household chores. So language brokering can disrupt the traditional structure and create tension in the family. This can have something to do with the lower perceived maternal support and lower regard for their mothers because they feel like they're doing more than the parent. Children also acculturate faster than their parents and assimilate into society faster, and this may create communication problems when the children are fully assimilated into the dominant culture and the parents aren't. Quite often, children are exposed to information that they probably shouldn't know, and sometimes they may use that information to get the upper hand in family disputes. And sometimes doctors, bankers, etc., they don't take the child language broker seriously and insist on speaking to the parent who can't speak English, which in turn causes trauma, frustration, and embarrassment. Some schools will actually retain language brokers in beginning level ESL classes so that they can translate for the new arrivals. This is really messed up because it's keeping the child from advancing just so that they can be the teacher's translators. Children who broker frequently feel less accepted by peers and have a harder time making friends, which could have something to do with them being more mature. They see things that other kids don't, and so they have a different perspective and may not get along well with kids their own age. Child language brokers are really incredible. They're not typical translators who simply translate word for word. There are studies on these child language brokers that show they know pragmatics, they know cultural conventions, and they know how to speak in different situations. These children already know how to modify the literal meaning of the message to fit the appropriate cultural and social context, as well as incrementing the chances of a successful outcome. They know how to modify the message so that the parents and the other party will understand each other. So this excerpt is from a parent-teacher conference, and you can see that the teacher's telling the parent that Maria, the child language broker, is a very good student. The teacher said she's always consistently very, very good and uses her time constructively. She's very cooperative with other students and always does her homework and classwork. She practices self-control and has been very good. She does a really good job and she completes her homework and classwork with quality. So Maria got a really good report from her teacher, but she downplayed and diminished these praises, telling her parent that everything is very good and she does well in class and on her homework. The reason she diminished and downplayed these phrases is because she knew her position in her culture and she's supposed to be a child. So she takes up a socially appropriate position and sounds more modest. She's supposed to downplay her ego, which is why she chose to do that. Child language brokers will also know how to speak with doctors, lawyers, school administrators, law enforcement officers, landlords, and banks. So it's just really, really incredible how much these children do. Even though institutions benefit from child language brokering, they also see it as a problem because many of these institutions are supposed to provide interpreters, but quite often they don't have them. They take advantage of the child language brokers, but they'll never admit they've dealt with these young interpreters because in many cases they're required, sometimes by law, to provide a translator. I often serve as an interpreter for two of my girlfriends who don't speak English. I was at the emergency room last week with Carla with her 8-month-old baby. The ER was real busy, and instead of getting an interpreter, which the hospital does have, they asked me to interpret. Yesterday, I was at the same ER with my friend Maria and her 13-year-old daughter. The ER wasn't busy this time, and I found it interesting that they wouldn't let the daughter or myself interpret. So I guess if they're real busy, they let someone interpret, but if not, they use a hospital interpreter. And by the way, both of my friends and their children are fine. Now, because of all these negative drawbacks, which have been studied, a legitimate question is being asked. Is child language brokering child abuse? And I guess it really depends. A lot of linguists working in this area don't think it's child abuse because childhood is really a socially and culturally constructed concept. For example, we know that in the 20th century, there was a shift from viewing kids as useful active contributors to the household economics to economically useless but sentimentally priceless. Children in the United States are viewed as precious, passive, and helpless. But that's not how other cultures see kids. There are many cultures who see kids as being active contributors to the household economies. In those cultures, kids are supposed to be useful and help out, and the work of these child language brokers is very important to their families. They serve as a bridge between the family and the larger society, so their work really should be viewed as a resource, as an asset, and as a skill. Interpreters are expensive, and even if they could be provided, families couldn't afford it, and the parents may not trust them. Families need someone 24/7 to interpret for normal everyday matters and in case of emergencies, which usually occur in the middle of the night. So you can see how important the work is these children are doing for their parents and family. So now let's talk about the implications of all of this. Some children have a greater sense of self-efficacy and some have greater respect for their parents while others don't. What this means is that a language broker's subjective experience with language brokering may influence the outcomes of the experience. The language brokers who report better outcomes usually feel more positively about language brokering or had better experiences. Those who constantly felt embarrassed, burdened, and stressed are the ones who thought negatively about language brokering, and they very well may have been the same ones who disrespect their parents. Now, parents may benefit from professionals' acknowledgement that language brokering occurs, that it's necessary for acculturation, and that it's necessary for the family. But now we need the larger community to acknowledge that language brokering exists. It does happen, and it's a necessary resource. And immigrant parents may need to be reminded that some tasks or concepts may be beyond the child's skills and understanding. So they need to choose carefully what they ask their child to do, and if something is way too hard, it could impact them negatively. The language brokers need acknowledgement for their work because what they do is not easy. It's very important, and they need praise from their parents. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone enjoys the remainder of the class.